Today, we are really embarking on something quite challenging, I think, more so than usual, maybe.
Yeah, I'd say so. The source material we're tackling, it's foundational philosophy, but it's incredibly rigorous, very uncompromising.
And the author's voice is just so distinct, isn't it? He's got this blend of like deep historical knowledge from philology, but also this sharp psychological insight.
Absolutely. And he's not just describing morality. He's aiming to dismantle it, or at least dismantle our assumptions about it. Everything we think is self-evident, he wants to question.
Right, things like good, evil, guilt, we tend to treat them as fixed points.
Exactly. And his whole project is to show they're not fixed at all. They're inventions. They have a history. They have specific conditions under which they arose, specific, psychological needs they fulfilled.
So our mission today in this deep dive is really to trace that genealogy, to follow his path back.
That's the core of it, asking that radical question. Where did these concepts actually come from? What were the circumstances? And crucially, what is their value now? Are they signs of strength or something else?
It reminds me of that quote he uses, something like, "We need a critique of moral values. The value of these values must itself be called into question."
Precisely. That's the gauntlet he throws down right at the start.
And this wasn't just an academic exercise for him, was it? He talks about this driving curiosity, this suspicion he had from a young age.
Yeah, he calls it his a priori, this relentless doubt about where good and evil really originated. He even mentions being, 13?
Yeah.
And thinking God must be the father of evil.
Yes. But then he moved away from that kind of theological explanation.
Right. His training kicked in, philology, history, that gave him the tools to look for answers in, human history and human psychology, not metaphysics.
Which is key, because he insists you can't understand a moral concept without knowing its origin story, how it became what it is.
Exactly. These value judgments, they don't just appear. They grow out of a specific context, a specific will. And that's the central question threading through the whole work. Do these values represent life saying yes, full-throated, powerful life, or are they symptoms of decline, of impoverishment, a kind of no whispered against existence?
That perspective changes everything. We're not judging the morality itself, but analyzing the health, maybe, of the culture that produced it.
We're diagnosing, using morality as a symptom.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we start? His critique of the prevailing theories of his time seems like the logical entry point. The English genealogists.
Yes, that's the immediate trigger for him publishing his own ideas. He mentions Dr. Paul Ray specifically and his book, The Origin of the Moral Feelings.
He read it and basically thought it was completely wrong.
Completely. He says Ray's book was the stimulus, but only in the sense that it provoked him into laying out his own hypothesis, which he claims refutes Ray statement by statement, conclusion by conclusion. He found the English approach fundamentally misguided.
So what was this English model that he found so topsy-turvy?
Well, Ray and other English psychologists, they had this sort of utilitarian, mechanistic view. They argued that actions we call unegoistic, like helping others, were originally praised simply because they were useful.
Useful to the person being helped or the community.
Exactly. They benefited someone. And then, the theory goes, over a long time, the reason for the praise, the sheer utility, was forgotten. People just kept praising the action, but now they mistakenly thought the action was good in itself, inherently good.
So utility first, then forgetting, then this error leads to our concept of moral good.
That's the sequence they proposed. Utility, forgetfulness, error morality.
And our author finds this just psychologically absurd.
Utterly. His main objection is, how could the utility possibly be forgotten? If an action is constantly praised because it's useful, wouldn't that usefulness be the most obvious, most constantly reinforced aspect? It should become clearer, not fade away.
Right. It makes no sense to forget the very reason something keeps getting positive reinforcement.
Precisely. But he sees a deeper flaw, too. This whole English model assumes that the concept of good originated from the perspective of the person receiving the useful action, the beneficiary.
And he thinks that's backwards.
Completely backwards. Historically impossible, he argues. As we'll see, he thinks value creation starts with the powerful, the actors, not the recipients. But beyond just refuting Ray's mechanism, this leads him to the much bigger issue, the value of this morality they're describing.
This is where he takes aim at Schopenhauer, right?
Yeah.
The whole elevation of the unegoistic.
Yes, Schopenhauer was huge then, and he championed pity, self-denial, self-sacrifice as the absolute pinnacle of morality, almost a metaphysical principle, a way of denying the will to live.
And our author sees this as not just wrong, but actively dangerous.
Dangerously wrong. He calls it a most sinister symptom of our European culture, a sign of exhaustion, of decay.
European Buddhism, that's a striking phrase. A path to nihilism.
That's exactly how he frames it, a detour towards valuing nothingness over existence. Because pity, he argues, inherently sides with suffering, with weakness, with failure.
How so? Why is affirming the sufferer so bad in his view?
Because it validates and perpetuates the state of suffering and decline. It tells the weak, the sick, the failing that their condition is somehow meritorious. It becomes for him a symptom of life turning against itself, of backward-glancing exhaustion.
So if you constantly prop up and praise decline,
You actively prevent the species, or the culture, from reaching its highest possible power and magnificence. He sees pity as comfortable, maybe less obviously destructive than outright cruelty, but ultimately more insidious because it undermines potential. It's demeaning to what humanity could be.
so the problem isn't just pity as an emotion, but the ideal, it represents an ideal that shies away from life's inherent struggle, hierarchy, the messy parts.
Exactly. He's questioning whether a morality built primarily on minimizing suffering can ever foster true greatness or flourishing.
And he brings history into it, saying this high valuation of pity is actually quite new.
Right. He emphasizes that this overvaluation is a modern phenomenon, a modern sickness. He reminds the reader that historically, many great philosophers had a pretty low opinion of pity.
Who does he mention?
Plato, Spinoza, Kant, La Rochefoucauld, quite a diverse group, you know. But they apparently agreed that pity wasn't a particularly useful or noble sentiment. It was seen as weak or fickle or just, not virtuous.
So the modern obsession with pity as the root of all good is, for him, evidence of cultural fatigue.
Clear evidence that European culture is, in his words, exhausted. It's lost its vitality.
Wow. Okay, that really sets a heavy tone for the rest of the analysis. We're basically being told our most cherished moral feelings might be signs of sickness.
That's the suspicion we have to carry with us as we move into his own theory of how values were created.
So let's get into that. He dismisses the utility model, the English psychologists. What's his alternative? This distinction between two fundamental types of morality.
Yes, the core distinction is between what he calls master morality, which operates on the axis of good and bad, and slave morality, which introduces the concepts of good and evil. They are completely different in origin and psychology.
Okay, start with the masters, the origin of good. Where does that come from, if not utility?
It comes directly from the good people themselves. That is, the nobles, the powerful, the high-ranking, the ones who saw themselves as superior. Good wasn't calculated. It was a spontaneous assertion.
The self-affirmation.
Exactly. They looked at themselves, their actions, their way of being, and said, this is good. And by implication, everything outside their sphere, the common, the low-ranking, the plebeian, was designated as bad. It's a judgment flowing outward from a feeling of power and fullness.
And the key psychological concept here is the pathos of distance.
Crucial, yes. The pathos of distance is that ingrained, persistent feeling of difference between a higher ruling type and a lower ruled type. It's the awareness of rank, of hierarchy, that allows the noble soul to create values.
They don't stop to think, is this useful?
Not at all. They act, they name, they decree. Value creation is an act of power, stemming from this feeling of distance. They define themselves as the standard, the truthful, the possessing reality, the noble. It's active, it's spontaneous, it's not a reaction to anything external.
And he uses etymology, language itself, to back this up.
Yes, this is where his philology shines. He argues the history of words shows this original distinction was social, not ethical. Take German schlecht, bad.
Okay.
Linguistically, it's the same root as schlicht, meaning plain, simple, common. It just referred to the common man without any inherent moral blame. Only later did it pick up the negative moral weight.
Interesting. So it was descriptive before it was judgmental.
Precisely. Or look at Greek. The word eslos meant noble, but its root seems to signify someone who possesses reality, who is truthful. Again, a statement about their perceived nature.
So we are the real ones, the true ones, becomes we are the good ones.
That's the shift. And Latin bonus, good, likely connects back to duinus, the older word for warrior. So good originally meant the fighter, the strong man, the man of conflict.
So in this master morality, good is the primary concept, born from self-affirmation. What about bad?
Bad is secondary. It's almost an afterthought, a pale contrast. It refers to the common, the low, the vulgar, the cowardly. The noble soul feels contempt for the bad, perhaps, but not hatred. They're simply beneath notice, in a way.
Okay, so that's the master morality, spontaneous, self-affirming, based on power and rank. But then comes the huge reversal, the slave revolt.
Eh.
This brings us good versus evil. How does this start? He points to the priesthood.
Yes, the priestly caste plays a key role. They often existed separately from the warrior aristocracy, maybe physically weaker, more inclined to thought, to brooding. Their power base was different rituals, purity, the internal world.
And they introduce a new kind of opposition.
They introduced pure versus impure. Initially, this might have been about concrete things, dietary laws, washing rituals, avoiding contact with certain people or things deemed unclean. But this distinction quickly gets internalized, becoming a basis for spiritual valuation. And because priests often lacked direct physical power, their impotence could breed a deep suppressed resentment or malice.
And he sees the Jewish people as the prime historical example of this priestly spiritual revenge.
He presents them as the paradigmatic case. The priestly people who, faced with powerful conquerors they couldn't defeat physically, achieved satisfaction through a radical transformation of their values, spiritual revaluation.
The most profound inversion in history, he calls it.
They took that aristocratic equation, good equals noble, powerful, beautiful, happy, favored by God, and they dared to flip it completely on its head.
So the powerful become
Evil. The rich, the violent, the sensual, the happy in this world become the evil, the cruel, the godless, the damned.
and the good become.
The poor, the powerless, the suffering, the sick, the ugly. These are now the good, the blessed, the loved by God. It's the ultimate revenge of the powerless, carried out in the realm of values.
And the psychological engine driving this is resentment.
Yeah.
Resentment.
Absolutely central. The slave revolt begins when resentment becomes creative. Unlike the noble who acts and affirms, the slave morality is fundamentally reactive. It starts by saying no to the outside world, to the values of the masters, to everything that is different and superior.
They can't act outwardly, so they create values inwardly.
Exactly. Their action is blocked, their powerlessness is real, so they compensate through imaginary vengeance. They invent an evil enemy, the master, to justify their own suffering and to define their own reactive state as good.
So the master defines himself as good first, and bad as secondary. But the slave defines the master as evil first, and then defines himself as good in opposition.
Perfectly put. Noble morality creates itself. Slave morality creates its enemy first. Its concept of good is born out of the negation of the master's evil.
And this involves a kind of psychological trick, doesn't it? Turning weakness into a virtue.
A necessary trick for survival and self-affirmation. The man of resentment has to convince himself and others that strength is not just strength, but a choice to be oppressive. That the bird of prey chooses to be predatory, when it could just as easily be a lamb.
So the strong person is guilty for being strong.
Precisely. By framing the master's nature as a matter of free will, the slave can condemn it as evil, and conversely, his own weakness, his inability to act, is reframed as a chosen virtue. Patience, humility, obedience, nonviolence. It's a brilliant, if insidious, weaponization of powerlessness.
That leads to that really provocative, almost chilling quote about the gates of Christian paradise.
Ah, yes. If Dante inscribed over hell, eternal love also created me, our author suggests that over the Christian paradise it should read, eternal hate also created me.
Why eternal hate?
Because he sees the promised bliss of that paradise, especially as described by church fathers like Tertullian, as rooted in the eternal satisfaction of watching one's former earthly enemies, the powerful, the persecutors, suffer eternally in hell.
So the joy of heaven is partly the joy of seeing the evil ones punished.
It's the ultimate, infinite discharge of that accumulated resentment. The gaze of the blessed upon the damned becomes the final metaphysical triumph of the slave revolt, the ultimate imaginary vengeance made real in theology.
That's intense. It frames the entire history of Western values as this ongoing battle between these two moral systems, Rome versus Judea, as he puts it.
A battle that, in his view, continues to shape everything.
Okay, so this slave revolt, this resentment, gives birth to good and evil. How does this tie into his ideas about guilt, punishment, and the bad conscience? These seem like central pillars of the slave morality.
They are, but their origins, again, are surprising. He argues they don't start as moral concepts. We have to first understand how memory itself gets created in humans.
All right, you mentioned this earlier. We are naturally forgetful creatures. Forgetfulness is necessary, like a porter at the door, keeping out overwhelming stimuli.
Exactly. Active forgetfulness is crucial for happiness, for psychic order, for being present. So nature faced this paradox. How do you breed an animal that can remember, specifically remember its promises? How do you make memory overcome forgetfulness?
What was the answer?
Long, hard, often brutal work. Millennia of what he calls the morality of custom. This involved imposing consistency, predictability, breaking the spontaneous willfulness of early humans. The end goal, the ripe fruit of this process, is the sovereign individual.
The person who can make promises.
Yes, because they have developed a strong, reliable, independent will. They have mastery over themselves and their impulses. And the proud awareness of this power, this freedom, this responsibility that he says is what we call conscience.
So conscience here is initially a sign of strength, of self-mastery, not guilt.
Absolutely. It's the privilege of the strong, the autonomous individual. But to get humanity to that point required some very crude tools. And that brings us to punishment and the concept of debt.
Guilt, he says, comes from debt. Should from Schulden.
Yes, he traces the moral idea of guilt, Schuld, back to the very material, very old concept of debt, Schulden. The oldest form of social contract is between creditor and debtor. This relationship, built on obligation and repayment, forms the bedrock for our later ideas of duty, responsibility, and eventually moral guilt.
And what happened if the debtor couldn't repay?
The creditor received compensation, but not necessarily money or goods. The compensation was often the right to inflict pain, to be cruel.
This is where the memory techniques get grim.
Extremely grim. He argues that to make something stick in the memory of this forgetful animal, you had to make it hurt. We burn something in so that it remains in the memory. Only something which never ceases to cause pain stays in the memory.
And he cites actual historical punishments.
Yes, he lists horrific old German punishments: stoning, breaking on the wheel, impalement, boiling in oil or wine. He argues these weren't primarily about justice or rehabilitation in our sense. They were mnemotechnics, ways of branding prohibitions, I will not do this again, onto the collective memory through sheer pain and terror. The severity of the penal code reflected how hard it was to overcome forgetfulness.
Let's focus on that compensation for the creditor, the pleasure of cruelty. That's a really stark claim, that justice originated in the enjoyment of inflicting pain.
It's central to his argument about punishment's origins. The creditor, unable to get his debt back, gets something else: the pleasure of exercising power with impunity. Inflicting pain and humiliation on someone powerless was a fundamental pleasure for early humans, he argues.
A kind of festival.
A festival, yes. A chance to feel like a master, to discharge power, to feel that lofty feeling of despising a being as someone below him. It was participating, briefly, in the rights of the masters. So punishment, in its origin, satisfied this raw desire for power and cruelty long before ideas of justice or fairness were attached to it.
Okay, so punishment is about external control, memory, and cruelty. But that doesn't explain the internal feeling of guilt, the bad conscience. He explicitly says punishment doesn't create that.
No, he's very clear. Punishment makes people more prudent, maybe harder, colder, more calculating. It tames them. But it doesn't make them better in the sense of having an inner moral compass or feeling guilt. The bad conscience, which he calls this most creepy and interesting plant, has a different, much more dramatic origin.
Which is?
The internalization of man. This happened, he argues, relatively suddenly and violently.
Forced internalization.
Through the abrupt imposition of the state. He uses that striking image. The state wasn't a gradual contract, but the work of some pack of blonde predatory animals, a conquering race imposing its form, its laws, its oppressive narrowness and regularity of custom onto a previously freer, more amorphous population.
Like a wild animal suddenly caged.
Exactly. Or his other analogy, the sea creature forced onto land, suddenly clumsy, heavy, struggling to adapt. Man, the animal with all his instincts for freedom, wandering, hunting, adventure, cruelty, suddenly finds all outward expression blocked by the walls of society and peace.
So those instincts have nowhere to go.
They have nowhere to go but inward. They turn back against the self. Man begins to tear himself apart, persecute himself, rage against his own nature. This internal struggle, this self-torment, this hostility directed inwards, that is the origin of the soul, as he understands it, and the origin of the bad conscience. It's man suffering from himself, an illness brought on by this violent domestication.
And this internal suffering, this bad conscience, gets massively amplified when the idea of debt gets mixed with religion.
Yes, that's the next crucial step. The simple creditor-debtor relationship gets reinterpreted on a grander scale. The relationship becomes between the current generation and its ancestors, its founders.
How does that work?
The tribe feels indebted to the sacrifices and achievements of previous generations who established the tribe's existence and power. As the tribe becomes more powerful, the perceived debt to the ancestors grows. It becomes immense, fearsome. Repayment might require greater and greater sacrifices, maybe even the firstborn, as he speculates.
And eventually, these ancestors become
Gods. Through fear and the mounting sense of unpayable debt, the ancestors are transfigured into deities. The more powerful the tribe, the more powerful and demanding the god. God is born from fear and debt.
This transforms guilt from a manageable social obligation into something potentially infinite.
Infinite and existential. And then, according to the sources, Christianity arrives with its God, the maximal God conceived so far. And with this maximal God comes the maximal feeling of indebtedness on earth. The bad conscience now has this ultimate framework to latch onto. Every natural impulse can be interpreted as a sin against this infinite God, leading to unparalleled mental cruelty and self-torment.
But then comes the twist: God sacrificing himself.
The stroke of genius of Christianity, as he calls it. God, the ultimate creditor, sacrifices himself for the guilt of humanity, the debtor, seemingly an act of infinite love and redemption.
But he sees it differently.
He sees it as the ultimate psychological trap. By having the creditor sacrifice himself for the debtor, it paradoxically makes the debt seem even more absolute, more unpayable by human effort alone. It confirms the infinite nature of the guilt. The creditor might be gone, but the debt remains, now magnified by this act of love, driving the self-torment of the bad conscience to its most horrifying, hard, and sharp extreme. It ensures the continuation of psychological suffering.
Wow. Okay, so we have this picture of humanity deeply marked by bad conscience, burdened by this infinite internalized debt, largely thanks to the slave revolt and its theological interpretation. Where does the ascetic ideal fit into all this? Poverty, humility, chastity. What purpose does that serve?
It's the master strategy for dealing with this condition, but its meaning isn't uniform. It depends on who is embracing it.
So for artists, for example, he mentions Wagner.
For artists, he suggests, the ascetic ideal often means, well, not much, fundamentally. Maybe it's a sign of fatigue or a kind of artistic pose. Since artists deal in appearance and illusion, maybe embracing asceticism is their way of trying to grasp at something real, or perhaps just denying the inherent unreality of their own creative drive. It's complex, possibly contradictory for them.
But for philosophers, it's different. They seem to genuinely embrace aspects of it.
Yes, but for highly pragmatic reasons. For the philosopher, the ascetic ideal isn't about sin or piety. It represents the optimal conditions for thinking. It's a kind of cheerful asceticism.
What does that mean?
It means cultivating independence. Freedom from distractions, from noise, from obligations, especially emotional ones that consume time and energy. They need isolation, the desert, as he calls it, to focus entirely on their dominant instinct, which is reflection, contemplation.
So things like poverty or chastity aren't ends in themselves.
No, they're tools, means to an end. Avoiding wealth avoids distractions. Avoiding marriage, for instance, avoids entanglements that hinder intellectual freedom. It's about ruthless self-discipline in service of their work, their highest potential. It's about optimizing their power, not denying it.
Okay, so the healthy, the strong thinkers, use the ideal strategically. But what about its main proponents, the priests, and its main audience, the sick herd suffering from bad conscience?
There, the ascetic ideal takes on its primary role. It becomes the main maneuver for the preservation of life among those who are suffering, degenerating, exhausted, filled with resentment. The ascetic priest is essentially the doctor for this flock.
And the priest needs to be sick himself, in a way.
Yes, he needs to be related to them, to understand their suffering, to speak their language. But he also needs to be strong-willed enough to lead them, to impose his will upon them. His role is deeply paradoxical.
How so?
He has to defend the sick herd from the healthy and the strong, who might despise or harm them. But maybe even more importantly, he has to protect the herd from themselves, from the destructive potential of their own accumulated resentment, which could lead to nihilistic self-destruction.
And his key technique is altering the direction of that resentment.
Precisely. Suffering people instinctively look for a cause, a guilty party. Someone must be to blame for my suffering. This is a dangerous impulse. The priest can't let them blame the healthy or the masters or God directly in a way that leads to rebellion.
So he turns it inward.
Yes. That's the genius, the terrible genius of inventing sin. The priest tells the sufferer, you yourself are to blame. Your suffering is your own fault, a consequence of your own sinfulness. It's psychologically false, he argues, but incredibly effective
Why effective?
because it gives the suffering a meaning, an interpretation. It channels the resentment safely inward. It prevents social explosion. It makes the sufferer the sinner, which is a role, a category, something to focus on rather than just being meaninglessly sick. It provides a framework for their misery.
What about the methods the priest uses? The medication. He calls them guilty methods.
Yes, because they offer temporary relief but ultimately worsen the condition, the priest uses techniques to induce powerful emotional discharges to break through the apathy and dull pain of the sufferers.
Like what?
Intentional emotional orgies, stirring up feelings of guilt, fear, anger, revenge, devotion through sermons, rituals, fasting, confession, creating intense psychological pressure points. He makes sin the biggest event in the sick person's life. These provide a narcotic effect, a temporary release.
But it's not a cure.
Not at all. It's palliative care that damages the patient. These emotional extremes, the constant focus on guilt and self-attack, they shatter the nervous system over time. He blames these methods for historical epidemics of hysteria, convulsions, and a general weakening of European vitality. The ascetic ideal, managed by the priest, becomes a long-term disaster for psychological and even physical health.
This seems like a total condemnation.
Hmm.
But then he makes this surprising link to science. Modern science sees itself as the opposite of the ascetic ideal, right? Based on facts, reason, reality.
That's the common view, yes. Science is the great antagonist to faith and asceticism, but he argues this is a superficial understanding.
How so?
He argues that modern science is actually the newest and most subtle form of the ascetic ideal itself,
Hmm.
because both ultimately rest on the same unquestioned foundation, an absolute unconditional faith in the value of truth. The ascetic priest believes God is truth. The scientist, even the atheist scientist, retains this fundamental belief that truth is the highest value, worth pursuing at any cost, regardless of its consequences for human happiness or well-being.
So the will to truth itself is the remnant of the ascetic ideal.
Exactly. It's the last, most refined, most disguised form of that metaphysical belief. Science hasn't overcome the ideal. It has inherited its core value, its unconditional demand.
And pursuing this truth often leads science to diminish humanity's place in the cosmos.
It often does. He points to Copernicus as an early example of decentering humanity. Since then, science has often seemed bent on reducing human self-importance, showing our contingency, our animal origins, the vast indifference of the universe. This aligns strangely with the ascetic ideal's own tendency towards self-diminution and world denial.
And when science reaches its limits or contradicts our deepest wishes, we get agnosticism.
Yes, and he sees agnosticism not as true skepticism, but as another subtle victory for the ascetic ideal. The hidden logic becomes, we cannot know ultimate truth, therefore there is room for faith, or therefore our uncomfortable wishes must stem from a flawed desire, not from reality.
It becomes a way to protect the underlying belief system.
By blaming the limits of knowledge, rather than questioning the value of the truth being sought or the wishes being frustrated, agnosticism inadvertently props up the old ideal that valued faith over worldly knowledge anyway. It's a sophisticated detour back to the same fundamental orientation.
This brings us to his final, sweeping conclusion about the meaning of the ascetic ideal for human existence as a whole.
Yes. His point is stark. For most of history, without the ascetic ideal, human life lacked meaning. The sheer amount of suffering seemed pointless. The question, why man, why suffering, had no answer.
And the ascetic ideal provided one.
It provided the only answer offered so far, he claims. By interpreting suffering through the lens of sin, guilt, discipline, and otherworldly redemption, it gave meaning to the seemingly senseless. It made suffering bearable by making it purposeful, even if that purpose was self-negating.
So the ideal, with all its negativity, the hatred of the human, the senses, the fear of happiness, the longing for escape, represented a fundamental will.
A will against life, a will to nothingness, a deep revolt against the very conditions of earthly existence. But, and this is absolutely crucial, it is and remains a will. Faced with meaninglessness, humanity asserted its capacity to will, even if it meant willing the negation of its own vitality.
Man will sooner will nothingness than not will.
That's the profound, disturbing conclusion. The drive to have meaning, any meaning, is so powerful that humanity embraced an ideal that ultimately devalued life itself rather than face the abyss of meaninglessness.
Okay, wow, we've covered a huge amount of ground here, tracing these concepts from the master morality, spontaneous good and bad, all the way through the slave revolts, good and evil, driven by resentment.
Leading to the invention of bad conscience through internalized aggression, magnified by religious debt.
And finally, culminating in the ascetic ideal, managed by the priest, offering a harsh meaning to suffering, but ultimately expressing this will to nothingness.
It's a complex and frankly quite bleak picture of our moral heritage.
So where does this leave us? What's the takeaway for someone listening today?
Well, the author points towards a kind of historical law woven into this whole story. Great things tend to destroy themselves through their own internal logic, self-cancellation.
And Christianity, or Christian morality, is subject to this too.
He argues it must be. Its own core value, absolute truthfulness, honesty at all costs, which it inherited and intensified, eventually has to be turned against itself. The demand for truth must eventually question the truthfulness of the belief in the God who demanded it.
So the death of God, which he talks about elsewhere, is partly a consequence of morality's own internal drive for truth.
That's the implication. And this creates the crisis, the threshold we stand on now, the potential death of that entire moral framework.
Which brings us to the final, really challenging question he leaves us with. If the belief in the God of the ascetic ideal fades,
Then the value system that propped up our faith in truth itself comes into question. The new problem becomes, what is the value of truth? Why should we value truth unconditionally now that its divine guarantor is gone?
we inherited this will to truth from the very system we're now dismantling.
Exactly. We are compelled by our own history, by the very honesty that morality instilled in us to ask, why truth? Why not untruth or illusion or art? Is truth always life-promoting? We have to put the value of truth itself on trial, experimentally.
And the fact that we can ask this question, that the will to truth has become self-conscious enough to see itself as a problem.
That, he suggests, might be the very thing that gives our current existence its unique, maybe precarious meaning. We are the experiment. Can humanity live without the absolute values provided by the ascetic ideal? Or will we, faced with that void, simply invent a new form of the will to nothingness because we'd rather will anything than face meaninglessness?
That's quite the precipice to leave us on. A challenge to examine our deepest assumptions about why we value what we value.
It demands ongoing thought, doesn't it? A real deep dive.
It certainly does. Thank you for navigating that with us. And for you listening, that's the thought to chew on, to ruminate over. Until next time, keep digging deeper.